In the vast, cloud-covered skies of the Second World War, few machines inspired as much awe and respect as the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. To those who saw it rise from the airfields of England, it was not just a bomber, it was a statement of strength, endurance, and the unshakable will to return home. The B-17 became one of the most famous aircraft of the entire conflict, known for its power, durability, and the incredible courage of the men who flew it. When the United States entered the war in 1941, it faced a challenge unlike any before. It needed to strike deep into enemy territory, far beyond the reach of friendly forces, across hundreds of miles of hostile airspace, and through waves of defensive fire. The aircraft chosen for this impossible task was the Boeing B-17, a four-engine heavy bomber, capable of carrying large bomb loads while flying at high altitudes and long distances. It was designed not only to hit strategic targets, but also to survive the journey there and back. Very soon, it proved that its nickname, the Flying Fortress, was no exaggeration. The design of the B-17 was ahead of its time. Its frame was built from lightweight but strong aluminum alloys, able to absorb heavy damage without collapsing. The aircraft's internal layout allowed it to keep flying even when parts of the wing's tail or control systems were lost. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing to reduce the risk of fire, and the crew compartments were partially armored to protect the pilots and gunners. With up to 13 heavy machine guns placed in turrets and windows, it could defend itself from nearly any direction. From the nose to the tail, every position had a role. The bombardier, navigator, pilot, co-pilot, engineer, radio operator, and several gunners all worked in perfect coordination. But despite all its technical achievements, the true heart of the Flying Fortress was always its crew. Most of them were very young, some barely 20 years old, facing dangerous missions that often lasted for hours at extreme altitudes, where the temperature could drop to -40 degrees. Inside the freezing cabin, they wore thick suits, oxygen masks, and heavy gloves, constantly alert for enemy aircraft or damage to their engines. Communication and trust were everything. A single mistake could mean disaster. Yet time and again, crews relied on one another and found ways to survive impossible situations. Many stories from the war describe B-17s returning to base in unbelievable condition. Engines shot out, wings torn, tails nearly destroyed. Some came back with holes large enough to walk through, others with no working instruments or with parts of the fuselage missing. Mechanics on the ground would stare in disbelief as these battered aircraft somehow made perfect landing. Every returning plane became a small miracle, proof that both the engineering and the human spirit behind it were extraordinary. For the people back home, the Flying Fortress became a symbol of faith and perseverance. It showed that no matter how severe the damage, there was always a chance to survive, to make it back, to live another day. Newspapers and newsreels told stories of bombers that refused to fall, of crews that never gave up, and of missions that succeeded against overwhelming odds. These tales spread quickly, turning the B-17 into more than just a weapon. It became an icon of resilience. Even after the war, the legend of the B-17 endured. Many of these aircraft were restored or preserved, appearing in museums and air shows, reminding new generations of their incredible history. Veterans who once flew them still spoke of their loyalty to the machine, calling it a friend in the sky. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was more than a product of metal and machinery. It was the embodiment of teamwork, courage, and the determination to overcome the impossible. It represented a generation that faced enormous challenges and refused to be broken. The sound of its engines, the sight of its wings against the sky, and the stories of its survival remain powerful reminders of what can be achieved when strength and hope come together. The story of the B-17 Flying Fortress began long before it became a legend in the skies over Europe. In the early 1930s, the Boeing Company in Seattle was competing to design a new kind of aircraft for the United States Army Air Corps, a heavy bomber that could fly farther, faster, and carry more bombs than anything built before. At the time, most military aircraft were still slow, fragile, and made with limited technology. Boeing's engineers wanted to change that. They believed in a bold idea that the next war would be decided not only by soldiers on the ground, but by the power of aircraft that could strike deep into enemy territory from the air. In 1934, Boeing's chief engineer Gifford Emery and his team began working on a secret project known as Model 20. The design was revolutionary for its time. Instead of two engines, the Model 29 would have four, each one providing more than seven. The goal was ambitious: to create a bomber that could fly at over 250 miles per hour, reach altitudes above 30,000 feet, and carry a bomb load of up to 2 tons. It was the most advanced aircraft design the world had ever seen. When the prototype finally rolled out of the Boeing hangar in July 1935, it was unlike anything the Army had imagined. Its long, elegant wings, slender fuselage, and powerful engines gave it a futuristic look. The press was invited to see the unveiling at Boeing Field. One reporter from the Seattle Times, impressed by the array of defensive machine guns placed all around the aircraft, described it as a flying fortress. The name stuck immediately, and Boeing quickly trademarked it. However, just when it seemed that Boeing had created the bomber of the future, tragedy struck. During a demonstration flight for the U.S. Army in October 1935, the prototype crashed after takeoff due to a technical error. The flight crew had forgotten to disengage the control locks. The pilot and one observer lost their lives. The Army declared the competition invalid, and Boeing appeared to have lost the contract. Yet, the military officers who witnessed the aircraft's earlier performance couldn't forget what they had seen. Despite the crash, the B-17's potential was undeniable. In the following years, Boeing continued to refine and improve the design, even without a full production contract. They used their own funds to keep developing the aircraft, believing that its time would come. By 1937, the Army ordered a small number of improved versions, designated B-17B, to be used for testing and training. These early fortresses were the foundation for what would later become one of the most important aircraft of the war. As the political situation in Europe grew tense in the late 1930s, and war clouds began to gather, interest in long-range bombers increased dramatically. The U.S. government realized that it needed an air fleet capable of strategic bombing, striking at enemy factories, transportation networks, and supply lines from afar. The B-17 fit that vision perfectly. By the time the United States entered the war in 1941, the B-17 had already gone through several versions, each stronger, faster, and better protected. The B-17E, introduced in 1941, featured a redesigned tail, improved defensive armament, and longer range. It was this version that first saw real combat and began to build the aircraft's legendary reputation for toughness and reliability. The creation of the Flying Fortress was more than just a technical achievement. It was a turning point in the history of aviation. Boeing's engineers had built an aircraft that redefined what was possible. It was not simply a tool of war. It was a symbol of innovation and determination. The men who designed it could not have imagined that within a few years thousands of these machines would be crossing the skies of Europe every day, changing the course of history. From the ashes of a failed prototype rose an aircraft that would become a legend, a machine capable of surviving the impossible. The birth of the Fortress marked the beginning of a new era, both for aviation and for the men who would one day fly her into the heart of battle. When the Boeing Model 29 first appeared on the runway in the summer of 1935, it was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Long, sleek, and powerful. It didn't just look like a bomber. It looked like a fortress in the sky. Reporters and military officials watched in awe as the prototype revealed its secret: a network of machine guns mounted in nearly every direction, from the nose to the tail, from the belly to the top turret. This aircraft could defend itself from attackers coming from any angle. It was during that very first public demonstration that a journalist from the Seattle Times wrote an article calling the new bomber a flying fortress. The name captured the imagination of the public and the pride of Boeing's engineers. Within days, Boeing officially adopted the nickname and registered it as a trademark. The term perfectly reflected what the aircraft was meant to be. Not just a bomber, but a heavily armed guardian of its own survival. The defensive design of the B-17 was revolutionary. Earlier bombers had relied on speed or altitude to avoid enemy fighters. But the B-17 introduced a new idea: to stand and fight. It carried up to 1350 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute. The guns were positioned to cover almost every approach path: the nose, the tail, the waist positions on both sides, the top turret, and the lower ball turret beneath the aircraft. Together, these positions created overlapping fields of fire, turning the B-17 into a flying sphere of protection. Every crew member had a job in that defense network. The pilot and co-pilot focused on flying, while the bombardier and navigator at the front could switch to man the forward guns during attacks. The top turret gunner protected the aircraft from enemies diving from above, while the belly turret gunner, in one of the most dangerous positions, lay curled inside a small rotating sphere made of steel and glass, defending the bomber from attacks coming from below. The waist gunners covered both sides, and the tail gunner, isolated in the very back of the plane, guarded the rear, where most enemy fighters preferred to strike. Operating these guns was not easy. Crews had to deal with freezing air at high altitudes, vibration, noise, and constant danger. Ammunition belts jammed, glass cracked, and the airmen often fought through frostbite and exhaustion. Yet, despite the challenges, the system worked. Enemy pilots quickly learned that attacking a formation of B-17s head-on, or from behind, was extremely dangerous. A group of flying fortresses could unleash a storm of bullets that made it nearly impossible for fighters to approach without taking hits. This heavy armament gave the B-17 a unique character. It was not just a bomber that dropped explosives and fled. It was a ship of war in the sky, capable of fighting its way to the target, and just as importantly, fighting its way home. The name Flying Fortress became more than just a title. It was a promise to the crews who flew it. Pilots and airmen trusted their aircraft as they would a shield. Many veterans later said that they believed the fortress took care of them, as if it had a spirit of its own. Its design gave them confidence that even when surrounded by enemy fighters, they still had a chance to survive. The walls of aluminum and the roar of the machine guns gave them courage. The Flying Fortress became an icon of power, not only to those who flew it, but also to those who saw it in the skies. To civilians watching from the ground, it was a sight of awe. Massive bombers flying in formation, sunlight flashing off their wings, their turrets glinting like armor. To the enemy, it was a symbol of strength and defiance, a reminder that no matter how much they tried to destroy it, the fortress could strike back. The name Flying Fortress captured everything about the B-17, its strength, its purpose, and its spirit. It was a name born from observation, carried by pride and proven in countless battles that lay ahead. Soon, the world would see that this title was more than just a catchy phrase from a newspaper headline. It was the truth. By the early years of the 1940s, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress had transformed from a promising design into the backbone of America's strategic air power. When the United States entered the war after 1941, thousands of young airmen were trained and sent overseas to join the newly formed 8th Air Force, stationed in England. From the green airfields scattered across the British countryside, the Flying Fortresses began their long journeys deep into enemy territory. Their missions were unlike anything that had ever been attempted before. Daylight precision bombing raids meant to cripple the enemy's industrial power and hasten the end of the war. Every morning, before the sun rose, the airfields came alive. Mechanics checked engines, loaded bombs, and tested machine guns. The smell of fuel and oil filled the air as crews gathered for briefings. They studied maps, weather reports, and photographs of their targets, factories, railways, refineries, and airfields far inside occupied Europe. The tension was always the same: quiet conversations, nervous laughter, and the silent knowledge that some of them would not return. As the first light appeared over the horizon, the sound of engines grew into a thunderous roar. One by one, the B-17s lifted off the runways, climbing slowly into formation. Dozens became hundreds, their wings glinting in the cold morning sun. From the ground it looked like an endless stream of silver arrows, stretching into the sky. Once assembled, they turned east, toward danger, toward their targets, and toward history. The flights were long and exhausting. Crews sat for hours in freezing temperatures, often at altitudes above 25,000 feet, where oxygen masks were necessary to survive. Inside the aircraft, the temperature could drop to -40 degrees. Communication was done through intercoms that crackled with static, and every man had to remain focused at all times. Above the clouds, the world was silent, until the first warning came. Radar and radio alerts signaled incoming enemy aircraft. The formations braced as groups of German fighters appeared in the distance, climbing to intercept. They came fast, from every direction, armed with cannons and rockets. The sky erupted into chaos. Engines roared, machine guns thundered, and tracer rounds streaked through the air. Every man in the fortress had a task: the gunners scanning the sky, the pilots trying to hold formation, the bombardier preparing for the final approach to the target. Unlike other air forces that bombed at night to reduce losses, the Americans chose to strike in daylight. This made them far more vulnerable, but it also allowed for far greater accuracy. The B-17's advanced Norden bomb sight, a remarkable piece of technology for its time, gave crews the ability to aim with precision from high altitude. Yet to reach the target, they had to survive a deadly gauntlet of enemy fighters, an anti-aircraft fire, the dreaded flak. Flak bursts filled the sky with black clouds of smoke and metal fragments. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the air, shaking the aircraft and peppering it with shrapnel. Pilots gripped their controls tightly, fighting to keep their damaged machines level. Despite the chaos, discipline and training prevailed. Crews followed strict formations, protecting each other with overlapping fields of gunfire. The bombers moved as one, a flying city of steel and determination. Finally, as they neared the target, the bombardier took control. The bomb bay doors opened, and the aircraft seemed to float for a moment in silence before the bombs fell away, disappearing into the clouds below. Seconds later, shockwaves rose from the ground, marking another strike in the long and costly campaign over Europe. With their mission complete, the fortresses turned for home. But their ordeal was far from over. Many aircraft never made it back. Some were hit directly by flak and torn apart in midair. Others limped home with engines failing, wings shredded, and smoke pouring from their fuselages. The crews who survived carried the memory of every mission with them: the friends lost, the fear faced, the sense of relief each time their wheels touched the runway once more. By late 1943, the B-17 had become the centerpiece of the Allied bombing effort. The battles over places like Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Berlin pushed the fortresses and their crews to the limits of endurance. The losses were staggering, yet the missions continued. Every return flight, every battered aircraft that made it home, strengthened the legend of the flying fortress. In the skies over Europe, the B-17 proved its worth not just as a weapon, but as a symbol, a machine that carried hope, courage, and the belief that even against overwhelming odds, the human spirit could still endure. Each mission was a test of faith, and each homecoming a quiet victory. The flying fortress had earned its place among the greatest aircraft ever built, not only for what it destroyed, but for what it survived. The B-17 Flying Fortress was not just a product of bravery. It was also the result of some of the most advanced engineering of its time. Every curve, every beam, and every rivet was placed with purpose to create an aircraft that could take damage, stay in the air, and bring its crew home safely. While many bombers were built to deliver destruction, the B-17 was built to survive it. Its legendary toughness was no accident. It was the result of brilliant design, innovation, and a deep understanding of what flight in war demanded. At the heart of the B-17's strength was its internal structure. Unlike earlier bombers that relied on external support beams, the B-17 used a semi-monocoque design, a combination of a sturdy internal skeleton and a strong outer skin made of aluminum alloy. This made the airframe both light and incredibly durable. Even if parts of the fuselage were blown away, the internal framework often held together, allowing the aircraft to remain stable. The wings, built around two massive main spars, could withstand enormous stress. Stories of B-17s returning to base with sections of the wings missing were not myths. They were real examples of this brilliant engineering at work. The designers at Boeing also focused on redundancy, meaning that no single hit would easily destroy the plane's ability to fly. The control cables that operated the rudder, elevators, and ailerons were duplicated and routed through different parts of the fuselage. If one line was severed by gunfire or shrapnel, the other could still function. Hydraulic systems were reinforced with backup mechanical controls. Even the landing gear could be cranked down by hand if power was lost. Every critical system had a backup, and sometimes a backup to the backup. Another major reason for the B-17's toughness was its four-engine configuration. Each of its Wright R-1820 radial engines produced around 1,200 horsepower, giving the aircraft not only power, but also safety in numbers. If one or even two engines were destroyed, the remaining ones could often keep the plane flying. There are numerous reports of fortresses returning home on one working engine, sputtering and smoking, but still flying. This redundancy turned what might have been a fatal hit for another bomber into just another obstacle for the B-17 to overcome. The fuel system was another example of foresight. The self-sealing fuel tanks were lined with layers of rubber that expanded when hit, sealing small holes and preventing catastrophic fires. Combined with armored protection around vital areas, especially near the cockpit and the bomb bay, these features significantly increased the crew's chances of survival. Even when flames did break out, the aircraft's aluminum structure was surprisingly resistant to complete failure, allowing pilots precious minutes to act. The B-17's aerodynamic stability was also key to its survivability. Pilots often described it as a steady, forgiving machine. Even when parts of the tail or wing were gone, it remained controllable. Its large wings generated enough lift to stay airborne at slower speeds, and its wide tail surfaces made it easier to handle during emergency. This stability gave pilots the ability to guide their wounded aircraft home, sometimes across hundreds of miles of hostile airspace. Inside the aircraft, the layout of the crew positions reflected both practicality and protection. The pilots and engineers sat high in the cockpit, surrounded by armor plating. The bombardier and navigator were positioned in the nose, close to the bomb site, but with quick access to the forward guns for defense. The ball turret, though terrifyingly exposed, was actually one of the safest positions in case of a crash landing due to its reinforced sphere structure. Every position was designed with both visibility and survivability in mind. Boeing's engineers didn't just build a bomber, they built a fortress of precision and balance. The combination of strong materials, clever systems, and thoughtful design gave the B-17 an unmatched ability to endure. Crews often said that the aircraft felt alive, that it somehow wanted to keep flying. It was a machine that could lose large parts of its body and still find a way home. Photographs from the war tell the story best. Bombers landing with gaping holes in their wings, tails barely attached, fuselage ripped open by flak, yet still intact enough for their crews to step out safely. Each one was a testament to the genius of its design and to the faith of the people who built it. The power of the B-17's design was not in its beauty or speed, but in its unshakable purpose. It was built to endure punishment, to protect its crew, and to survive against overwhelming odds. Every successful return added to its legend and proved that engineering, when guided by courage and vision, could create something truly extraordinary, a machine that refused to fall. Among the thousands of missions flown by the B-17 Flying Fortress during the Second World War, there were a few that became the stuff of legend, tales so extraordinary that even today, they sound almost impossible. These were the flights where aircraft, torn apart by battle and gravity itself, somehow stayed in the air long enough to bring their crews home. They were the moments when metal and machines seemed to possess something greater than engineering, a will to survive. One of the most famous of these stories is that of a B-17F named All-American. In February 1943, during a bombing raid over Tunisia, All-American was attacked by enemy fighters. As it began its return journey, one of the fighters rammed into its rear fuselage, slicing almost the entire tail section away. The collision ripped open the aircraft, leaving only a few thin pieces of metal, holding the tail to the body. Crew members could see straight through the back of the plane into open sky. The pilot, Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg, fought desperately to maintain control. Despite the severe damage, the B-17 held together. The crew stayed at their stations, using their weight to balance the aircraft. Against all odds, the All-American flew more than 300 miles back to its base and landed safely. Photographs of the aircraft taken after landing shocked even Boeing's engineers. It should not have been able to fly, yet it had. Another story, equally remarkable, is that of the B-17 known as Yellow Pub. In December 1943, on a mission over Bremen, Germany, the aircraft, piloted by Lieutenant Charlie Brown, was heavily damaged by anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters. The nose was shattered, one engine destroyed, and several crew members were wounded. Separated from its formation and struggling to stay airborne, the bomber seemed doomed. Then something unexpected happened. The German fighter pilot, Franz Stiegler, approached the crippled fortress. Seeing the condition of the crew, injured, unarmed, and clearly unable to continue the fight, Stiegler made a decision that went against every rule of war. Instead of finishing them off, he escorted the damaged bomber out of German airspace, saluted the American pilot, and turned back. Brown and his men made it home. Decades later, the two pilots would meet again as old men, their unlikely encounter having become one of the most powerful stories of honor and humanity in wartime. There were many others. The B-17 Knockout Dropper became one of the first bombers to complete 75 missions, a record at the time, and returned home covered in patchwork repairs. Another, 909, flew 140 combat missions without losing a single crew member. Each of these aircraft carried scars that told stories of survival. Hundreds of bullet holes, shredded control surfaces, and patched aluminum where flak had torn through. Crews spoke of aircraft returning with massive holes in their wings, elevators missing, and engines on fire. One bomber, nicknamed the Patchwork Queen, returned to base with over 1,000 holes in its fuselage and still managed to land. Another was reported to have flown home after losing nearly 6 feet of its wingtip. In some cases, bombers made it back without working hydraulics, using hand-cranked landing gear and sheer determination. Mechanics on the ground became witnesses to miracles. They would watch as these wounded machines limped home, engines sputtering, smoke trailing behind them, the crew praying with every mile. When the wheels finally touched down, men on the airfields would cheer, not just for another mission completed, but for the survival of their brothers. Every landing of a damaged fortress was a reminder of why the aircraft had earned its name. For the crews, these experiences created a bond stronger than anything else. They often described their aircraft as having a spirit, something alive, something that refused to give up. Many believed that the fortress took care of them, that it somehow shared their will to live. It became a partner in their struggle, a silent companion in the chaos of battle. These stories spread quickly among the airmen. They boosted morale and became part of the mythology of the war. New crews arriving in England heard the legends of All-American, Ye Old Pub, and others, and they began to believe that the B-17 truly was indestructible. That belief gave them courage when they climbed into their own aircraft and faced the endless skies of Europe. Today, these stories still echo through history books and museums. Photographs of twisted metal, torn wings, and smiling crews standing beside their battered aircraft remain some of the most iconic images of the war. They remind us that the B-17 was more than a machine. It was a symbol of endurance, of teamwork, and of hope. In every one of those missions where a fortress limped home against all odds, there was something larger at work, the perfect blend of human determination and engineering genius. Together, they created moments that would live forever, turning ordinary missions into legends of survival and courage that continue to inspire generations long after the engines of the flying fortress fell silent. Inside every B-17 flying fortress, 10 men shared the same small world, a world of noise, cold, and constant danger. They were the heart of the machine, and without them, even the most advanced aircraft would have been nothing more than metal and fuel. Every mission they flew demanded total trust in one another. Survival depended not only on skill, but on teamwork, discipline, and unbreakable courage. A standard B-17 crew consisted of 10 members: the pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, and 5 gunners. Positioned in the nose, the top turret, the ball turret beneath the aircraft, the waist on both sides, and the tail. Each man had a specific job, and each one relied on the others completely. They trained together for months, learning to think and act as one unit. When they climbed aboard their fortress, they were not just soldiers, they were a family. The pilot was the leader, responsible for every life on board. He had to make impossible decisions: when to push forward, when to turn back, when to risk everything to bring the crew home. Sitting beside him, the co-pilot managed the engines, the instruments, and often took over during combat if the pilot was injured or overwhelmed. Below them in the nose section sat the bombardier and the navigator, 2 men who worked with absolute precision. The bombardier used the Norden bomb sight, a revolutionary device that allowed him to aim bombs with remarkable accuracy, while the navigator guided the fortress through endless skies of cloud, flak, and enemy fighters. Behind them was the flight engineer, who monitored the engines, fuel, and mechanical systems. He was often the most technically skilled man on board, able to diagnose problems in midair, and in many cases, repair them while the aircraft was still flying. The radio operator maintained communication with base and other aircraft, sending coded messages and keeping the crew connected to their formation. The rest of the crew formed the aircraft's defense. The gunners each had a narrow field of vision, a freezing metal seat, and the constant roar of the engines in his ears. The ball turret gunner, perhaps the most famous and feared position, was strapped inside a small rotating sphere beneath the bomber. He fought lying on his stomach, surrounded by glass, able to move in any direction but completely exposed. Above him, the top turret gunner defended the aircraft from enemy fighters diving from above. The waist gunners, positioned on each side, were responsible for protecting the flanks, while the tail gunner, isolated in the very back, faced the deadly responsibility of guarding the rear, the most common direction of enemy attacks. Conditions on board were brutal. At high altitudes, temperatures could drop to 40 degrees. The men wore heavy, electrically heated suits and oxygen masks to keep from freezing or losing consciousness. Frost formed on their goggles, and their breath turned to ice. The constant vibration of the engines shook their bodies, and the deafening noise made conversation nearly impossible without the intercom. Every mission meant hours of sitting in the cold, scanning the skies, and waiting for danger to appear. Fear was always present, but so was determination. The men learned to focus on their tasks, to trust their training, and to draw strength from one another. They shared jokes, songs, and superstitions, anything to keep their minds sharp and their spirits strong. They decorated their aircraft with nose art, painted names and symbols that made each bomber unique. Memphis Belle, Shoo Shoo Baby, 909, Chow Hound. These names gave the aircraft personality, as if they were living companions sharing the same fate as their crews. Before takeoff, they gathered for briefings in cold wooden huts, listening to officers describe the day's target. They studied maps and flak zones, nodded silently, and filed out to their plane. Each man performed the same small rituals, checking his gear, adjusting his gloves, glancing at photographs of loved ones tucked inside his jacket. The engines started with a deep growl that filled the airfields of England, and soon the bombers lifted off, climbing into the gray sky. During missions, communication was short and precise. There was no room for panic. Enemy at 2 o'clock. Flak ahead. Bomb bay doors open. These were the voices of survival. When things went wrong, and they often did, the crew worked together instinctively. If the aircraft was hit, the engineer and radio operator would check for damage. If a gun jammed, another gunner covered the blind spot. If a man was injured, someone else would drag him to safety, while still firing back. Every decision, every action depended on teamwork. Back on the ground, when they finally returned from a mission, they didn't speak much at first. They climbed down from the bomber, exhausted, faces blackened with sweat and smoke. Only later, over coffee or whiskey in the mess hall, would they talk about the near misses, the friends they had lost, or the quiet moments when they thought they wouldn't make it back. But the next morning, when their names appeared on the flight list again, they got up, dressed, and went back to the airfield. Duty always came before fear. The men of the Flying Fortress were ordinary young men, placed in extraordinary circumstances. They came from farms, cities, and small towns, from every corner of America. Many had never flown before the war, yet they became part of one of the most elite and dangerous missions in history. What united them was their shared trust in each other, in their training, and in the fortress that carried them through the sky. They were not just crew members, they were brothers, and together they gave life and meaning to the name Flying Fortress. Flying inside a B-17 was an experience few could truly imagine. A world of freezing temperatures, thunderous noise, and constant danger. The skies over Europe were not only filled with enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire, they were also a brutal environment where nature itself became an enemy. For the crews of the Flying Fortress, every mission meant facing both the fury of battle and the cruelty of the elements. At high altitude, the air was thin and bitterly cold. The B-17 often flew at over 25,000 feet, where the temperature could plunge to 40 degrees Celsius. Inside the aircraft, there was no insulation, no heat, and only the thinnest sheet of metal separating the men from the frozen sky. The sound of the 4 massive engines never stopped, a constant roar that filled their helmets and vibrated through their bones. The air smelled of oil, gunpowder, and sweat. Frost crept along the windows and over the metal guns, biting into their bare fingers whenever they had to reload. Each crew member wore a bulky flight suit lined with sheepskin and connected to an electrical heating system. But the power was unreliable. When it failed, frostbite set in quickly. Fingers stiffened, faces froze, and breathing became painful. They wore oxygen masks connected to long rubber hoses, because at such altitudes, the air was too thin to survive without them. If a hose tore or a valve froze, a man could lose consciousness within seconds. Sometimes in the chaos of battle, masks were ripped away or shot through, and men suffocated quietly while still at their station. The ball turret gunner, trapped inside the small sphere beneath the aircraft, suffered the most. Curled in a fetal position, with almost no room to move, he spent hours rotating the turret in every direction, scanning the endless blue-gray horizon for enemy fighters. His view was both magnificent and terrifying. The vast world below, the sky full of vapor trails, the explosions of flak bursting like black flowers. If the plane lost power, the turret could jam, trapping him inside. Every mission carried that risk, yet they still climbed into it, time after time. When the fortress was hit, chaos often erupted in seconds. Holes appeared in the fuselage, the wind screamed through the cabin, and the temperature dropped instantly. Flames could spread across the wings, filling the air with choking smoke. Oxygen lines burst into small fires, and men scrambled to extinguish them while still trying to defend the aircraft. Despite the cold, sweat poured down their backs as adrenaline took over. They fought not only the enemy, but also the aircraft itself, a machine shaking, bleeding, and burning, yet still flying forward. In these moments, communication became a lifeline. The intercom crackled with voices, short, calm, and focused. Flak, 9 o'clock low, top turret, reloading, engine 3 on fire. There was no shouting, no panic, only discipline. Each man knew his job, and each one trusted that the others were doing theirs. When a gunner went silent, they all felt it, but there was no tide to grieve. Not yet. The mission had to continue. Between combat and chaos came long stretches of stillness, silent hours of flight, where the only sound was the hum of engines and the occasional click of a gunner adjusting his weapon. In those moments, fear settled in quietly. The men would stare at the endless clouds and think about home, about families, friends, and places far from the sky. Some prayed, some stayed silent, and some hummed songs to themselves, trying to drown out the cold and the thoughts that came with it. As they approached enemy territory, the tension rose again. The sight of black flak, clouds exploding ahead, was enough to make every heartbeat louder. The fortress would shudder as fragments tore through its body, slamming into the metal walls, punching holes through the floor. They watched other bombers take hits and vanish into smoke. The cold air was filled with the smell of burning oil and the echo of distant explosions. And yet, despite the terror, despite the cold and exhaustion, the crews endured. They held their positions, fired back, and carried on with their mission. It was a strange balance between ice and fire, between fear and focus. Every second was a fight for survival, but they had learned to live within that chaos, to find calm inside the storm. When they finally turned for home, the tension did not fade. Returning was often harder than attacking. Damaged engines sputtered, oxygen ran low, and the cold grew sharper as fatigue set in. Men drifted in and out of consciousness, frost forming on their masks. Pilots gripped their controls tightly, forcing the wounded aircraft onward. Every mile toward England felt like a victory. When the coastline finally appeared through the clouds, it felt like waking from a nightmare. The crew would exhale, sometimes in silence, sometimes with tears or laughter. The sound of the landing gear locking into place was the most beautiful noise in the world. The fortress, scarred and smoking, would touch down on the runway, and the men, exhausted, shivering, and alive, would climb out into the cold English air. For them, the war was a battle not only against the enemy, but also against nature itself. The ice, the wind, the thin air, these were enemies they faced on every mission, yet they conquered them through endurance, discipline, and faith in each other. In the heart of that frozen chaos, they proved that the flying fortress was more than a machine. It was a home in the sky, a fragile, freezing, roaring home that somehow carried them through both fire and ice. As the war progressed, and stories of the B-17 flying fortress spread across airfields, newspapers, and homes around the world. The aircraft became more than just a weapon. It became a legend, tales of bombers returning with their tails shot off, engines ablaze, and wings full of holes, captured the public imagination. To many, the B-17 seemed almost alive, a supernatural machine that refused to die. But behind the myth stood a complex mixture of truth, exaggeration, and the powerful human need to find hope in the darkest of times. The B-17's reputation for invincibility began early in the war. Reports from the 8th Air Force told of fortresses limping home after suffering unimaginable damage. Photographs circulated in magazines like Life and Stars and Stripes, showing aircraft with missing sections of fuselage, burned wings, and shattered glass. One image of the famous All-American, its tail nearly severed after a mid-air collision, astonished readers. These pictures seemed to prove what everyone wanted to believe, that the B-17 was unbreakable. The myth grew with every mission. Crews passed stories from one squadron to another. A fortress that flew back with one engine, another that landed safely with its nose almost gone, another that returned from deep inside Germany on fumes and prayer alone. Some of these stories were true, others stretched by memory or retelling, but all of them fed into the same belief, that the B-17 had a spirit of its own. Yet the reality was far harsher. The B-17 was indeed strong, but it was not indestructible. Between 1942 and 1945, thousands of fortresses were lost in combat. Entire formations disappeared in clouds of black flak. Many never made it home, crashing into fields, forests, or the cold waters of the North Sea. For every miraculous return, there were others that ended in silence. The cost of daylight bombing was enormous. Tens of thousands of young men never came back. Still, the myth had its purpose. It gave crews courage. The belief that their aircraft could survive anything gave them strength to face another mission, to climb once more into the freezing sky. In war, morale could mean the difference between life and death, and the legend of the flying fortress provided just that. The B-17's reputation became a psychological armor, a shared faith that if they trusted the fortress and each other, they might see home again. From an engineering standpoint, the truth behind the legend was impressive enough on its own. The aircraft's robust construction, redundancy in critical systems, and ability to absorb damage were unmatched for its era. Its four powerful engines, thick wings, and balanced design made it capable of staying airborne under extreme conditions. Many of the so-called miracle returns were not miracles at all, but testaments to brilliant design, skilled piloting, and sheer determination. Still, memory has a way of polishing facts into something more luminous. After the war, as veterans told their stories, the line between reality and myth blurred. Each generation that heard those tales added a little more admiration, a little more wonder. Films and books such as 12 O'Clock High and Memphis Belle reinforced the image of the indestructible bomber and its heroic crews. The fortress became a symbol, not only of technology, but of courage, endurance, and sacrifice. Historians later pointed out that the legend of the B-17 reflected something deeper about the human spirit. People needed heroes, and in the brutal air war over Europe, the flying fortress and its crews provided them. They embodied resilience in its purest form, men and machines that faced impossible odds and somehow endured. Whether every story was true or not mattered less than what those stories represented. Defiance against fear, faith against despair, and the will to keep going when everything seemed lost. Even decades after the war, the myth remained. Restored B-17s still fly in air shows, their engines rumbling like thunder over peaceful skies. Crowds look up and feel the same awe that people felt 80 years ago. For many, the sight of a flying fortress in flight is not just a glimpse of history, it's a reminder of what humanity can achieve when courage meets purpose. In the end, the truth and the legend of the B-17 are intertwined. It was neither invincible nor mythical, but it was extraordinary. Its toughness was real, its design brilliant, and its legacy eternal. The men who flew it made it legendary, not because it could never fall, but because time and again it refused to stay down. That is where the myth meets reality, in the stubborn, unbreakable will of those who believed that no matter how much damage the world could inflict, there was always a way home. When the war finally ended, in 1945, the skies over Europe grew quiet. The thunder of engines, the distant hum of formations, and the echo of flak guns all faded into memory. The B-17 Flying Fortress, once a daily presence over England and Germany, had completed its mission. But even as the aircraft were decommissioned, dismantled, or left behind on forgotten airfields, their story was far from over. The legacy of the Flying Fortress and the men who flew her would live on for generations, not just as history, but as a symbol of courage, endurance, and sacrifice. In the immediate aftermath of the war, thousands of B-17s were no longer needed. The rapid end of the conflict meant that many aircraft were scrapped, their metal recycled into the raw material of peacetime. To those who had flown them, seeing their trusted fortresses cut apart was heartbreaking. These machines had been their homes, their protectors, and their lifeline. Yet a few were spared, saved by museums, collectors, and veterans who understood that the B-17 represented something greater than just steel and rivets. In the years that followed, a handful of surviving aircraft found new life. Some were used for reconnaissance or weather research, others in movies that captured the imagination of new generations. Films like 12 O'Clock High and Memphis Belle brought the legend of the Flying Fortress to the screen, reminding audiences of the bravery and the cost of those high-altitude missions. The B-17 became a cinematic icon, the sound of its engines and the sight of its silhouette instantly recognizable even to those who had never lived through the war. Across the United States and Europe, museums began to restore surviving fortresses to flying condition. Aircraft like Sentimental Journey, 909, Texas Raiders, and Yankee Lady took to the skies once more, their engines roaring, just as they had decades earlier. Crowds gathered on airfields to watch them pass overhead, a living connection to a time when the fate of the world was fought above the clouds. For many veterans, seeing or hearing that familiar sound again brought back floods of memories. The smell of oil and gunpowder, the faces of lost friends, and the feeling of a young man's hope and fear. The legacy of the B-17 also lives on in the countless personal stories preserved by families and historians. Diaries, letters, and photographs from airmen tell the human side of the Flying Fortress, the jokes, the fears, the friendships formed under fire. Many veterans spoke of the bond they shared with their aircraft, describing it not as a machine but as a living thing. Some believed that their plane wanted to bring them home, that it somehow shared their will to survive. As decades passed, the Flying Fortress became a centerpiece of remembrance. Each year, commemorative flights, air shows, and memorial services honor the crews who never returned. The rumble of the B-17's four engines is not just a sound from the past, it is a tribute. Every takeoff of a restored fortress is a salute to the bravery of those who flew them and a reminder of the sacrifices that secured freedom. Today, only a few B-17s remain airworthy, carefully maintained by passionate historians, volunteers, and aviation enthusiasts. Their continued flight is both a technical and emotional achievement. Restoring one requires years of work, thousands of parts, and an understanding that goes beyond mechanics. To keep a flying fortress in the air is to preserve not just an aircraft, but a living memory of a generation defined by courage and resilience. For younger generations, the B-17 stands as a powerful educational tool. Schoolchildren walk through its narrow fuselage in museums, imagining what it must have been like to sit in the freezing cold, surrounded by the thunder of engines and the fear of enemy fire. They see the small spaces where 10 men lived, worked, and fought for hours at a time. They begin to understand that history is not just about battles and machines. It's about people, In every way, the legacy of the Flying Fortress continues to inspire. It represents not only the triumph of engineering, but also the triumph of spirit. It reminds us that even in the darkest moments, humanity can produce something extraordinary, a combination of ingenuity, courage, and hope, strong enough to rise above destruction. The B-17 Flying Fortress has long since ceased to be a weapon of war. Now it is a messenger of memory. When one passes overhead today, its engines echo across the sky like distant thunder, carrying with them the stories of those who once fought and fell beneath its wings. It is a sound that connects past and present, a living bridge between generations. The Flying Fortress endures not because it was invincible, but because it symbolized what people are capable of when they refuse to surrender. And as long as even one still flies, the spirit of the fortress, the unbreakable will of its crews and the nation that built her, will never fade from the sky. The war eventually ended, the guns fell silent, and the skies that once thundered with the sound of engines became quiet again. The B-17 Flying Fortress, a creation of metal, sweat, and courage, had done its duty. But long after the final mission was flown, its legacy refused to fade. The fortress became more than a bomber. It became a symbol of endurance, sacrifice, and the unbreakable human spirit. For the men who flew her, the memories never disappeared. Decades later, veterans could still close their eyes and hear the deep rhythm of the four engines, feel the vibration, the fuselage, and see the world spread out far below, clouds, flak bursts, and the glint of other fortresses flying beside them. They remembered the fear, the freezing cold, the long hours of waiting, and the sudden moments of chaos when everything seemed lost. But above all, they remembered each other, the faces, the laughter, the voices on the intercom. Those bonds, forged in the thin, icy air of war, lasted a lifetime. Many of those who survived carried the war with them quietly. They went home, built families, and lived ordinary lives. But part of them always remained up there in the endless blue. For them, the fortress was more than a machine. It was a protector, a companion that had carried them through fire and brought them safely home. When they spoke of it, there was always a kind of reverence, a gratitude that went beyond words. They knew what the aircraft had endured for them, and they never forgot. For those who never returned, the fortresses became their memorials. Their names, once painted below nose art and cockpit windows, now live on in museums, in history books, and in the stories told by their families. Each surviving B-17 that flies today carries not just the weight of its structure, but the memory of all the others that did not make it back. Every rumble of its engines is a heartbeat from the past, a voice whispering across generations. We were here, we flew, we did our duty. The story of the Flying Fortress is not simply about war. It is about endurance. It is about the will to rise again, no matter how much is lost. The aircraft's strength came from its design, but its spirit came from the people who built it, maintained it, and flew it. It reflected the best qualities of those who created it: resilience, courage, and faith in one another. Even today, when a restored B-17 climbs into the sky, people stop and look up. They watch the silver shape glide through the clouds, the engines echoing like distant thunder, and they feel something powerful, a connection to a time when the world seemed on the edge of darkness, and ordinary men rose to extraordinary heights. In that sound, there is pride, sorrow, and awe. The fortress has outlived its war. It now belongs to history, yet it continues to speak to us, not of destruction, but of survival. It reminds us that strength is not measured by perfection, but by the ability to keep going when everything seems broken. It teaches us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to face it anyway. In every sense, the B-17 Flying Fortress was a machine built for war, yet what it left behind was peace. It stands as a reminder that even in the most violent moments of history, there can be acts of humanity, loyalty, and grace. The fortress did not only carry bombs, it carried hope. And long after the last one lands, that hope remains aloft. As the camera fades to the horizon, the sound of engines grows softer, becoming one with the wind. A single B-17 glides into the sunset, its shadow stretching across golden clouds. Because in the end, the true legacy of the Flying Fortress is not that it could take incredible damage and still fly home. It is that it taught us something eternal, that no matter how torn, how battered, or how lost we become, we can always find our way back.